and talk a little bit about food, nutrition, and culture. So, hopefully bring some of the food and the demo and this tour that Rosetta just took us on, back to some of the food culture and nutrition. And to start, I just want to share a quick story with you. When I finished my dietetics degree, I was teaching a class at the University of Utah. It was called Healthy Weight for Life. And I asked my students this question. I said, does America have a food culture? And I didn't go in with any sort of preconceived idea of what their answer should be. There was no right or wrong answer, but I was just really curious, as a people, America was kind of founded as this melting pot. We have people who come from all over. Yes, we have holiday traditions, but I was curious if people thought that we really had a food culture. So, with that said, I want to dive into Italy, which is a place that has a very rich food culture. And Rosetta mentioned it's not so much the country itself, Italian food, but it's these regional cuisines that are based on a lot of different things. So what is Italian food? And, Rosetta, I love that you mentioned there's really no such thing as Italian food. And a lot of this really depends on perspective. Because as Americans, I think, oh yeah, we think about going out to an Italian restaurant, or what you see in front of you is a picture of a Chicago deep dish pizza. We're like, yeah, pizza's Italian food, no matter what kind of pizza it is. And that's because as Americans, I think we lump a lot of foods that we would find in the region of Italy, as just Italian food. So Italian food is definitely, I think the way we view it is, through this lens of perspective and who's asking and where's it coming from. But also geography. So you'll remember in this tour, Rosetta, I loved your slide with the map of Italy and going around and, just showing us where the rivers are and where the mountains are, because so much of the regional cuisine and the culture behind it is based on what is available where. And so I think a lot of the culture and a lot of the types of dishes that are prepared are based on that. If you have ricotta made from a sheep's milk down in the southern part of Italy, you're going to use that to make something like polpette. Or if you are in the northern part of Italy where there are more creams and butters, that's what's going to inspire a lot of your culture and the dishes there. And then the last thing I think, for me, Italian food and this perspective that I think about it in is a lot about tradition. So when we're talking at the very beginning about what food means to us, I mentioned my grandparents, their heritage is being from Italy. And so I mentioned my love of these ravioli we have at Easter time. And my grandparents have since passed away. But the one thing I asked for from my grandma was her pasta maker. And so ever since she passed away, my family has continued this tradition, no matter where we are, if it's, a lot of us or just, 4 of us, I have 2 little boys, together we make ravioli. And so it is this, long process that's just filled with so much love and remembering of my grandparents. But we roll out the pasta dough and we make our ricotta cheese and we stuff them and we, hand shape them and cook them. And it's just become something that's really fun. So for me, Italian food is, a lot about tradition as well. So I want to show you this picture of, some foods and then tie these things to, those 3 lenses that we talked about, and also to different dishes that you may think of. So I saw one person asked in the chat, what vegetables might you grow in a home garden, or do you see grown in Italy that you may, incorporate into your own cooking? And Rosetta mentioned wine and grapes. And so Italy is they produce a lot of wine. And so you see some vineyards in the picture on your screen. And wine in Italy is a little bit different in terms of how it's culturally part of meals. And I remember visiting family once, and I have a cousin who was at the time 8 years old, and we're sitting down to a meal, and they just, he had a little glass of water and they poured a little splash of wine in his glass. And as American, I was kind of like, oh, that's really interesting. But it's just, when you think about flavors and culture and tradition, it was just part of the meal. Those flavors are part of the meal. And my family has a winery. And so it's very much part of the culture to, hey, this is the wine that we need to taste it. We need to make sure it's good. It's part of what we do every day. And also I remember my cousin asking me how much wine costs in the United States. And, I told him, and it differs based on type of bottle of wine. And he was kind of incredulous. He thought, wow, a good bottle of wine really, it's ubiquitous. It should just be part of your meal. It shouldn't cost more than, a couple euro. And so, it's just interesting to think about the cultural differences. I have olives on here. Rosetta talked a little bit about, the southern part of Italy being rich in olive oil production. We talked a little bit about herbs. Rosetta, I love what you said about serving things simply. You have these fried ricotta balls that are very simply served. And I remember, some of the herbs that you routinely see in Italian cooking. You think of things like oregano and sage, basil to make pesto. And one time we were enjoying these fried sage leaves, and they were these beautiful, rounded, really thick, firm sage leaves that were just fried like you just demonstrated in some olive oil and sprinkled with, some sea salt. And that was it. And you just tasted the sage, and it was so good. So we came home and we figured we had to make these. And so to this day, I have this huge sage plant in my yard in one of those kind of chopped off wine barrels. And, it's a perennial herb. So every year it comes back, and the leaves are now really big. And so we can make these fried sage leaves at home. And it's, it takes us back to Italy, but it's just such a delicious dish that's just made from an herb. You see, on your screen there, a picture of Italian parsley. So Rosetta, I think this is what you use to sprinkle over. But Italian parsley, when you go to the store, this is the flat-leafed parsley. Sometimes it's called flat-leaf parsley. And don't confuse it with cilantro. They have totally different flavors. Cilantro has a little bit more rounded edges, but Italian parsley is a really, really fresh, wonderful herb that is just really nice in a lot of different dishes. Let's see, the coasts, Rosetta, you talked about, Italy, depending on where you are in the boot, there's a lot of water that surrounds Italy. And, it sits in the Mediterranean. And, I think because of that, a lot of Italian cuisine is generally thought of, when we think of the Mediterranean diet, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But on the east coast of Italy, on the Adriatic Sea, which is where my family is from, there is lots of seafood. And I remember being at a dinner once, and I think it was a 7-course meal, and every course was a different type of seafood, because that's what's there. And that's just part of what they were serving, because you're fishing in the Adriatic Sea, and you can get, fish and seafood there. So the other thing that we've talked a little bit about is cheese. And I want to talk a little, Italy, when it comes to cheese production as a country, produces the most variety of cheeses in the world. And in terms of volume of cheese, they are the 3rd largest cheese producer behind Germany and France. And Italy has so many different varieties of cheese. And, what's really interesting is, Rosetta mentioned this, there are certain types of cheeses that are very, very distinctive to a certain region of Italy. So like Parmigiano Reggiano or a mascarpone. And they have something called the protected designation of origin, which if you ever see on a food product that's being imported, from Italy specifically, but the EU has also adopted this designation, it may say DOP on it. And for wine, it'll say DOC. But what that is that it's part of this, protected designation. And to receive that, it can only be produced in that region. So in your box, you have cheeses that are made in the style of these cheeses, that you would find in this particular region of Italy. And so you can use a local cheese to make, a dish that might use, a cheese that was produced in this particular region. So just wanted to highlight that. It's something that, we may not always know. 2 of the cheeses in your box, so the mascarpone and the Parmesan, both come from the northern part of Italy, kind of in that Lombardy region, which is where Milan is. And then, ricotta is typically a cheese that you would find in southern Italy. It can be made with sheep's milk or cow's milk. So some other regional dishes that I want to highlight. So we talked about butter and creams really being more indicative of northern Italian cuisine. Also think of stews and a diet and dishes that are richer in meat. And think about what's going on in northern Italy when it comes to geography, and that's where the Alps are and the Dolomites, and so you're making foods that are not only available in that region, but also it's colder up there, and so you have foods that are kind of more typical of that type of climate, and also very much influenced by what you would see in Austria or in Germany or in France. And, I mentioned that the Parmesan and the mascarpone are from that region. Also in kind of north central Italy, you'll find like tagliatelle bolognese. So, a tagliatelle, which is a flat, kind of egg-like pasta, long pasta that's in more of a meat sauce. And then in southern Italy, things are made, much more with the durum wheat pasta, olive oil, and also pizza. So when you think about pizza, Naples is famous for pizza. It's traditionally a thin crust pizza with really fresh ingredients, that are topping the crust. So I want to take a step back because all of these foods, the fruits and vegetables, tomatoes a lot of tomatoes are grown in Italy as well, but these herbs, they're indicative of a Mediterranean style diet. So Italy, Greece as well. And on our Dairy World Tour, we'll be visiting Greece at some point over this year. And so what is the Mediterranean diet? And I bring this up because I think it's really interesting. The dietary guidelines for Americans are released every 5 years. And, I'm going to talk about this just because I'm a dietitian. So I'm going to provide a little bit of context. So the dietary guidelines come out every 5 years. And even though they offer recommendations for individuals on how to eat to maintain a healthy lifestyle, to reduce risk of obesity, reduce disease risk, it's more than that. They become the guiding principles that set a lot of policy related to food and nutrition in the United States. So when we think of policy around SNAP benefits or policy around school nutrition, the dietary guidelines help shape that. Well, 5 years ago, in the 2015 iteration of the dietary guidelines, it was the first time they really talked about eating patterns and meal patterns that could promote overall health. And one of the patterns that they recommended is the Mediterranean eating pattern. And the reason that that's recommended is because when we think of the Mediterranean diet, it's very rich in fruits and vegetables. It's rich in whole grains. Meat is used as a condiment to a lot of dishes. Rosetta explained this really well when she said your polpette and brodo, the ricotta balls in the sauce, they're in the broth. You could add a little bit of sliced ham or some prosciutto, but it would be kind of a condiment, and added to that. So meat is considered a side dish. Dairy, just because it's ubiquitous throughout that region, is absolutely included and is a rich source of protein in this diet. So this Mediterranean eating pattern is associated, when we look at scientific literature and studies that have been done on health and populations and eating patterns, we see that it's routinely associated with overall good health. And just recently, like over the last 2 weeks, there were a couple studies published that continue to show this with specific health conditions. There was a study that showed a correlation between a Mediterranean style eating pattern and improved cognition in older adults. A study that shows that the Mediterranean diet helps with prostate cancer progression. So we continue to see that there's mounting evidence that the Mediterranean eating pattern is a healthy eating pattern. So as I was looking into this, and I thought, okay, well, if in the dietary guidelines for Americans, we're talking about the Mediterranean eating pattern being a recommended style of eating for good health, what do Italians recommend? Like, are there Italian eating guidelines? And yes, there are. And so what you see on the screen are the guidelines. I am not going to go through these in any sort of detail, but I bring this up because these were first released in 1986. Italy as a country was noticing just its population, it was just like a lot of the world, rising obesity rates, increased disease. And so the guidelines were really meant to get back to a more traditional style of eating, eating foods that are local to the region, and getting back to that typical Mediterranean style eating pattern. So these are the guidelines that you would see in Italy. And again, the recommendation is here is to just improve overall health of the population and reduce disease risk. And I think it's interesting. Often, a lot of these recommendations, we think about getting back to the basics and enjoying local foods when we can. So also in this context, when we think of the Mediterranean diet, and we look at Italy and we look at, diets that help promote and connote, overall health, I think back to the blue zones. And so this was, some research that was really done in the early 2000s around pockets of the world where we found the highest concentration of centenarians, so people over 100 years old. And researchers started noticing that there were these pockets where it seemed like people in these societies had greater longevity. And so they wanted to dive into why was that? Like, what about these particular regions allowed there to be such longevity? And as with most things, it's multifaceted and it's complicated. But one of the things that they come back to is food and the role that food plays in these diets. And the first blue zone that was ever identified is in one of those islands off the coast of Italy, in Sardinia. And what we find is when you look at the diets of people who fall into this category is that they're eating local foods. They're following this traditional Mediterranean style eating pattern. And food is a social thing. There's a lot of tradition. There's a lot of culture wrapped up in it. So a lot of the things we've talked about today, a lot of the meaning that food has for us, is what we find in all of these regions across the world that have populations who are living longer. Physical activity is obviously a part of it as well, but diet does appear to be, an important part of these correlations.